Testing.
We know how these work. Hi, John.
Hi, Craig.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. This is a treat for me and for all of us, and a really fun book. I mean, the years that I was, discovering music, MTV was new, FM radio was playing a huge range of stuff, and there y'all were, and this was a glimpse through the screen, through the radio, into an era of pop music history that I'd really never read much about. It's been focused in other areas, but we've got to know each other over some years of you playing as a solo artist at Music City Roots, and we've had a few chats before, but this is great to stretch out a little bit. The thing that's just jumped out early on and kept jumping out was the phrase, I wrote in my journal, ... You had these journals. How many? When did you start? What motivated it?
I started keeping a journal in the spring of 1970, just as I was ready to graduate from college, because I just assumed that anything I was going to do after graduating from college would perhaps set the course for the rest of my life. And as it turned out, I knew Daryl, but we weren't working together. We were friends and we had hung out, but we had no formal, kind of professional relationship. So I went off to Europe, and I ended up chronicling basically the entire decade of the 70s. I stopped in the 1980s, and I had 13 handwritten volumes, which in the course of a few interviews with my co-writer, Chris Epting, he was fascinated with these journals, and I made copies, sent him the journals, and he began to make a timeline, basically. And occasionally, his dog would sit on one of the pages, and then he said, that's where we're starting. So wherever the dog sat is where we started. So I'm actually telling the truth.
What surprised you when you reread and found things? What came back that might not have if you had just been trying to conjure up from memory?
I didn't read them again. Chris would dictate things for me. Mm-hmm. He would find things that jumped out to him. Yeah. What kind of jumped out to me? For some reason, I had this OCDC thing. OCD? What is it? What disease am I trying to describe?
That's an obsession with heavy metal.
With heavy metal?
Yeah, OCDC.
That's the one. Yeah, I did write a book. Anyway, I had this compulsion to jot down things that I ate, like big lists of really horrible stuff, like in the 70s, like 4 Zagnut bars, a quart of Haagen-Dazs, 3 ham sandwiches. I don't know why I did that. Chris thought that was kind of amusing, and I said, no, we're not putting that in the book. So none of that is in the book, just so you know.
Are you happy with your memory? Do you feel like it's I struggle with this, because I think about being in 10th or 11th grade. It's tough. It's a blur. Do you live there? Do you like it?
No, I think I have a pretty good memory considering, but the amount of experiences that I've had, as the book process began and as I began to write, it was like regressive therapy in a way. These memories would start, and then they would open up a pathway to another memory, and that would open up a pathway to another memory. And of course, we spoke to other people, bandmates, and people who were involved in the early days, and they would tee me up for yet another memory. And it kind of unlocked a series of paths to follow.
Okay. Well, origins of your songwriting and your passion with the guitar and with song, so much of it was channeled through falling in love with folk music and having these really fortuitous encounters with some of the giants of the organizers of the Philadelphia Folk Festival, and through them, Doc Watson, Mississippi John Hurt, and others. And that fascinated me when we first met. Just talk about how that began to take what you recognized and loved about it, and how it set a template for you as a writer.
Well, I went to Philadelphia in the mid-'60s, right after, in high school, basically. And when I first started college, I was looking for a job. And I got a job teaching guitar lessons at a place called Esther Halpern's Folk Guitar Studio. One of the more senior guitar teachers was a guy named Jerry Ricks. Jerry was a very accomplished guitar player. He also ran the door at the Second Fret, which was one of the premier folk clubs in town. So all the folk performers would come through town. And so Jerry basically knew everyone. He also lived across the street from Dick Waterman. At a time, Dick Waterman had discovered and photographed many, many of the early roots performers as they were coming up to Philadelphia. And of course, they couldn't afford hotels. They would sleep on Jerry's couch or Dick's couch. Bonnie Raitt was Dick's girlfriend. So if you want to know why Bonnie's so good, it's because she was in the room with, Robert Pete Williams and all these people learning to play slide guitar. So just being at Jerry's house, I'd go over and there would be Doc or Mississippi John Hurt sitting on the couch, and I'd watch them play. And I had this incredible, I just was in the right place at the right time. It was just the most magical, place to be.
When you began to contemplate writing pop songs and entering the world of rock and roll, was it directly applicable? Did you build what your ability to write hit songs on some of that knowledge?
Well, I think I've always had kind of a musical multiple personality. I loved early rock. I loved R&B. And so I kind of used to joke that one day I'd have a sharkskin suit and I'd play in an R&B band. The next day I'd have a work shirt on and be playing in a coffee house, playing traditional blues or whatever. And to this day, I'm kind of actually doing the same thing. I mean, with Daryl, it's like the sharkskin suit, and Music City Roots, it's like the work shirt. But I love it all. And to me, I see a connection in that music. To me, growing up, I'm old enough to have grown up before rock and roll. I actually remember music before rock and roll was invented, basically. So, growing up my parents listened to big band music. That was the music I heard first. And then when rock and roll happened in the early 50s, I was aware enough to realize something new had happened. So it really gives me a different type of perspective on things, I think. I look at it kind of holistically in a way. The roots of rock and roll or the roots of American traditional music are really one and the same.
So what did you recognize in Daryl and Daryl in you? What was the beginnings of that relationship like, sparking off of musical references, culture, or just personal chemistry?
Well, when we first got together to try something, we went to the Temple University radio station because it was the only place I knew of that had a tape recorder. And we actually tried to record something together, and it sounded awful. We kind of looked at each other and went, this will never work, just forget that. He was classically trained. He sang in church. He was a piano player. I was not classically trained. I was a guitar player. It was, kind of seat of the pants kind of thing, folk music. And I learned a lot from his piano playing because he was much more sophisticated musically than I was. And he learned a lot about the traditional side of American music from me. And we really blended those two things together. And as we did over the years, we were able to come up with an original approach. But if you really go into our songs, there's always a little bit of those two things happening.
Yeah. Who here knew that they were whole oats before Hall & Oates, before you read the book? Anybody knew that? That was a revelation to me. I probably went with the better name there in the long run, I'd say. But
I think both names suck, till they'll tell you the truth. Hall & Oates sounds like a law firm, and Whole Oats just sounds like some hippie band, but, well, we kind of were, so.
Well, it worked then for a first project and for a lot of gigs. Just talk about, first, maybe how playing cover songs dovetailed with writing and figuring out what your strengths were as writers together, and who was going to sing a line. And you're not going to be the Everly Brothers. You're not like a kind of twin harmony, close harmony brother act. There's a real dynamic of getting through several albums to what it really became.
Well, I think we both. We didn't get together to form a band. We didn't get together to be successful. We didn't get together to be the biggest selling duo in the history of music. We got together as a reaction to the things that weren't happening. Daryl was working in a bar band. He was recording with another band that he didn't care for. I was playing in a blues band and doing some coffee house shows. It was really nothing was connecting. And we kind of got together as, a reaction to that. And we said, you know what, why don't, you've written some songs, I've written some songs, let's just play them. I'll accompany you, you accompany me. And so our partnership was based, really predicated on being two individuals working together. And that's why we always insisted on having our names Daryl Hall and John Oates, as opposed to Hall and Oates, which, is just a bit more convenient for the world, I guess.
Did that then allow, and I think you get into this nicely in the book, that the musicians who wound up as you're in your band, they too had a role to play in the final altogether sound, right?
Well, I make a very big distinction, and I've always have, between a song and a record. The things that you hear when you buy a record and the things that you kind of take to heart and remember, that's really not necessarily the song. The song is the pure creation and the inspiration that comes when a writer picks up a guitar or his instrument and hopefully has an inspired moment and creates something from nothing. The record is what happens is when you take that into a recording studio and you combine it with technology, musicians, engineers, producers, and that flowers into something different, and that becomes a record. So yes, that's a long-winded answer to your question. Our bands over the years have had an integral part in making those records because their input and their skill was really very, very important. And over the years, we've had many bands, and I must say, we've been very blessed to have some of the greatest musicians in the world playing with us over the years.
Yeah. The stretch that was most exciting to me as a music journalist and a historian of this stuff was right between Abandoned Luncheonette and War Babies. Such different records. In fact, the first three, you guys are both notable that you're exploring and making three very different sounding records, but that you were given the chance to do that. The business was different then, and you were able to explore. So talk about that stretch of invention.
Well, first of all, when I look back on my life and career, I am so grateful that I was able to start and during a period of time when musicians made music and record companies tried to figure out how to sell it. And it was a very clear line of demarcation between the two jobs. And no one ever told us what to do musically. And when we were done, we handed it to them and said, here it is, you figure out how to sell this. And I'm just very grateful that I came up during that period of time. But we made the whole Oates album was very folky and acoustic. The Abandoned Luncheonette was like a blending of Philadelphia R&B with acoustic music. And because neither of those records was successful, really, commercially, well, we had no mandate to repeat ourselves. There was no reason to, why do something again if there was, if the world wasn't, kind of endorsing it and saying, hey, hey, that's great, it's a big hit, whatever. So we went and did War Babies with Todd Rundgren, which was an experimental rock album. And, sure, they were three different things, but when you take those three albums together and you blend the various moments and the various influences and the various sounds that we achieved, they kind of came together on the Silver album, which was the first one where we actually had a hit record. So it was kind of a stepping stone toward forming an original sound, I think.
How influential was just in the air at that time? You had rock records that were getting quite operatic and conceptual. You had jazz fusion, and you had Return to Forever and what Miles Davis was doing at the time. Did that creep into those sessions on War Babies?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what happened was we had gone on the road in 1972 with Whole Oates, and we opened for a lot of kind of similar acts, acoustic-oriented, kind of quiet. And then after the Abandoned Luncheonette album, we actually opened for David Bowie during his Ziggy Stardust Spiders from Mars tour. Yeah. And Daryl and I were on stage with mandolins and acoustic guitars playing this kind of folky little stuff. And ding-a-ding-a-ding. And David Bowie came out with strobe lights and a spandex suit and giant platforms and orange hair. And I went, oh. And I said, Daryl, I think we need amps. Big amps. And that was it was eye-opening, I have to say. I realized we started to play bigger venues as opening act, and the bigger venues we played required a little bit more of a in-your-face attitude and a little higher energy, and we weren't performing that way, and that's what really caused us to step it up.
tell the story that you tell in the book so well about going, adapting to the glam look and feel, and you hired a makeup artist, and that is a hilarious story.
Well, yeah, okay. The album you're talking about is the Silver album, which is the first album we called Daryl Hall and John Oates. No one ever calls it that. And we were wearing tons of makeup, but if you look at it in the context of the time, that was glam rock was really big. Edgar Winter, Mick Jagger, Todd Rundgren, Rick Derringer. If you look at albums from that period of time, everyone had makeup, and it was this kind of Greenwich Village thing that was happening. And we ran into a guy named Pierre LaRoche, who was the Rolling Stones stylist. And he was a very flamboyant Frenchman. And he said to us one day, he said, "Your album covers suck. I will immortalize you." And he did. And interestingly enough, to this day, it's the only album cover anyone ever asked about. So I guess he did.
Right. It speaks to your ability to admit that success and being a communicative musician is more than just seeking your own personal true sound and sticking to it. That there is an ability to adapt and listen and deliver something that is of the time and the context, and that ain't nothing wrong with that. That if you can make a great record by doing that, it can be successful. And I imagine pretty satisfying in a different way than, say, I love playing fingerstyle country blues to audiences that love it, that small audience that cares and will come to see it, but to really make an impact by adapting.
I think it had to do a lot to do with moving from Philadelphia to New York.
Really?
New York City had an energy that Philadelphia didn't have. Philadelphia had the roots of Philadelphia music, R&B and folk music, was kind of formed the foundation. But once we moved to New York, I think just the energy of that city and the pace of that city, and being a songwriter and being sensitive to your surroundings, I don't think we couldn't help but reflect it in some way. And so the more aggressive style, the more kind of experimental stuff came, I think, directly from living in New York.
The good time to ask about the song "Man-Eater," because it was one of those rock and roll kind of high life moments that turns into a song, but you adapted it a little bit. What's the story there?
Everyone thinks Man-Eater's about a woman, and it was inspired by a woman, but it's not about a woman. It's actually about New York City, because I used to hang out at a place called Mary Lou's in Greenwich Village, and it was a hangout for a lot of groovy 80s types, models and actors and musicians. And one night I was sitting at a table with some friends, and this very, very beautiful gal came in, and she was just incredibly gorgeous. And she sat down across from me at the table, and she had a mouth like a sailor. She had the foulest mouth of any human being I'd ever heard. And she was so beautiful, it was so weird and crazy that I went, oh man, she would chew you up. And I went, ding, and I thought, okay, we got something here. And I went back and came up with the idea for Man-Eater. But I wrote it as a reggae song. And I played around with it, and I actually went to Edgar Winter's house to do a co-write with him. And I said, hey, man, check this out. And I played him this reggae version of a chorus for Man-Eater. And he just ignored me. He didn't like it, I guess. And then I went back to Daryl and played it for him. And Daryl went, yeah, that's cool, but let's not do reggae. Let's do like a Motown thing. And he came up with the piano thing, the boom, 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 ba-dum-da-dum-da-dum. And then as we started to write about it, I told him the story about the girl, and that kind of got us going. But he and I went, you know what? It's not good enough. Let's write about something bigger, something more universal. And so it was the 80s, it was the Wolf of Wall Street era in New York, where greed is good and more is better and money, money, money. And so that's what the Man-Eater is actually the city itself.
Fantastic. You did really work in this world at a time when pop music and really American culture did become sort of decadent, and really over the top, late 70s and through the 80s. The rock and roll culture has kind of in many ways tempered and become a little more normalized. You don't see, artists don't even get signed anymore if they're truly crazy people. Like in the 70s, anybody could get, a genius could get a record deal, and they sorted out their crazy later, with lawyers and with paying the bills and
I
everything.
think it was an asset to be crazy back then.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Now the industry, music, I think, but so I guess I'm getting it. Now you're making music that is, you could say, more organic, more down to earth, more folk oriented. Did we need to go through, did American culture or something need to go through that unbelievably decadent phase? How do you reflect on those years?
Well, I think here again, music and art in general are always a reflection of the time. They're a reflection of the people and the generation that create it. So the 70s and 80s were crazy, and so the music was crazy, and the people, you acted crazy, and record companies, there was as much crazy stuff going on in the boardroom as there was backstage. Right. Record companies were doing lots of drugs, and it was crazy. And I think everyone had to pull back when people realized that it just couldn't sustain itself as a business. And unfortunately, I think the downside of that was that the record companies started to assert more creative control because they were afraid of spending money with crazy people. They were giving, people who were stoned millions and millions of dollars, and they weren't delivering records, and they were staying in the recording studio for 2 years. Mm-hmm. Well, that wasn't going to hold up when the bean counters took over. And so I think that led to what you have today, where record companies and the music business in general are much more integrally involved in the actual creative process.
Mm-hmm. On the subject of not craziness, I kept waiting for you and Daryl to have the inevitable falling out followed by the reconciliation in the story, and it doesn't come. You guys have had chemistry. What's going on there?
Well, we've known each other since we've been 17. He and I know each other. We're like brothers. We really are. And like brothers, you can have your differences, but in the end, there's a connection there. And we have this very solid foundation of musical influences. We were both brought up in small towns in Pennsylvania with the same type of families, went to the same schools, listened to the same radio growing up. And that's the common foundation and the strength. And then to set that apart, I guess you'd call it the yin and yang of it, is that we're completely different as people in terms of the way we live, the type of things we like to do when we're not making music. Strategies for succeeding in life are completely different. You don't have enough time for any of that. But so in a way, we don't get in each other's way personally, and we have a lot in common musically. I think I'm simplifying it, but I think that's probably just the easiest thing to.
Right. It's a real. I mean, what a blessing! What a blessing! That's
we've had plenty of creative differences, and a lot of times in the studio we do things 2 or 3 different ways. Sometimes we do, like he'd say, "I want to do it this way," and I go, and he'd go, "Okay, well, let's do it my way, and then we'll do it your way, and see what happens." Mm-hmm. And usually, then we, the band, and just. I think just having common sense and wanting to succeed and wanting whatever we did to be as good as it could possibly be override. It was more important for that to happen than it was to satisfy your ego just to say I'm right. And I think we both have the ability to do that.
Marvelous. Another relationship I wanted to ask you about that must have been really extraordinary and made some wonderful, colorful stories is George Harrison. You met a lot of musicians, but it'd be hard to hang out with a more musical person and one of those, the most interesting Beatle.
Most interesting Beatle. I don't know about that, but he was a great guy. When I first met George, we met because I was friends with a lot of race drivers in England. I'm a race fan, as you know, Craig. So is Craig. He may not tell you, but he is. And Jackie Stewart introduced us.
Nice.
A famous Jackie Stewart race driver. And George was a big race fan, and we got together over racing. And I wasn't a real Beatle fan. I wasn't a big fan of the Beatles. Of course, I love them and appreciate it, but I wasn't like gaga and over them. And so when I met George, it was more like we met as fans of racing, and then we hung out and we got to be friends, and he invited me to his house, and I almost didn't want to ask him to play. It was weird. I said, oh God, I'm thinking to myself, everybody's going to ask George Harrison to play, so I'm not going to ask him to play, and I didn't, and then one day I did, and I said, do you want to play on our record? And he went, only if I can be in the band. And I said, okay. I said, you don't want to do anything like special? Or nope. because I just want to be in the band. And he came and he spent a whole day with us, played acoustic guitar on about 3 or 4 tracks with an amazing band that we had assembled. And he was so happy because he wasn't in the center of attention, he wasn't in the spotlight, and he was that kind of person.
So one of the long-running dramas, dramatic arcs in the book is business. And at one, I wrote down the phrase, 20-year financial fiasco. A tough, brief take on the subject of money and success. Tell folks what they need to know about what's in the book on that subject.
Well, you'll read it in the book and that will be pretty self-explanatory. But one thing I do want to say before I get into it is that if you look at the history of American popular music, you will find artists and creative people being taken advantage of by business people from the very beginning. And it goes back to the earliest days when the bluesmen came up the Mississippi and landed in Chicago, and somebody handed them a record contract and a bottle of wine and said, here, sign here, we'll make a record with you. And, they signed their life away. So what happened to Daryl and me was really in the great tradition of getting screwed by the music business. So, I'm actually kind of proud of that, and kind of in the same boat as Chuck Berry and James Brown, so that's pretty cool. Anyway, when you have creative people who just want to write and just want to tour and record, there's always someone who will step in and say, let me take care of that other stuff for you. You don't want to be bothered with all this stuff, this business stuff, and we'll take care of it. You go out on the road and you party and have a good time and be a rock star, whatever it is you want to do, and keep making those great records, and we'll take care of everything else. And whenever you allow that to happen, various things are going to happen on your behalf or to you. And that's exactly what happened. And I'm not going to speak for Daryl. Daryl's, it's my book, and I'm saying it because I know what I didn't do. I didn't pay attention. I didn't make myself knowledgeable. I didn't spend enough time looking at the details. And I was more interested in just making records and having fun and touring. And I paid the price with a kind of a financial comeuppance, I guess you'd call it. But it all happened, at the same time in the late 80s. Daryl and I had decided to stop touring. And I got divorced, had this financial issue. Our manager jumped ship and went to become the president of a major record company, all at the same time. And so what seemingly was the darkest time in my life, and it was for a moment, actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, because it made me grow up. It forced me out of this protracted adolescence of pop stardom, and it forced me to take a hard look at who I was and who I wanted to be and who I could be going forward. And that's what I write about in the book. And I basically sold everything I had and moved to Colorado and lived in the mountains and met a gal, got married, had a kid, built a house, and now I'm in Nashville, and everything's good.
Shaved off your mustache.
Oh, yeah, shaved off the mustache. Thank you for applauding my maturity.
I've got one more question, and then let's start queuing up questions from you guys. I don't know how the microphone's going around, or if it's a stand and talk. Is there a floating mic?
Oh, they can talk. It's pretty.
Okay, it'll just be
they can just yell.
Raising hands. Good stuff. Well, I did want to ask about Nashville. You don't really address your current project and your current posture and what drew you here. I know songwriting and the songwriting community was part of that. But describe to folks what you are up to now, what your focus and passion is now musically.
Well, I'll start by saying when I got to 400 pages, I realized even my mother doesn't want to read any more about John Oates. And I hadn't even gotten to the last 17 years and my move to Nashville. And I felt so bad about it, I actually freaked out because I didn't realize that I had written so much. And when I realized it just was impractical to write more, and I didn't want to shortchange my Nashville experience because it's very important to me, and it's really given me a new creative life. And I didn't want to shortchange it. I wanted to go into it in depth and really give it the what it deserves. So I basically just had to stop. So hopefully, if you guys like this book enough, there'll be a volume 2. But Nashville really got my creative juices flowing again in the mid-'90s. I started coming here as a songwriter, and I began to write. And then once I started writing, began to make friends, spending more and more time, and eventually moved here. And it's been the best thing I've ever done for myself because I've now been really grateful to be accepted in this amazing music community here.
And I'll say a word of cheer on the folks at the Americana Music Association, and we feel like we're part of having this resource. Your channel of your life and your musical passion that is roots-based and that is song-based and that lets us hear what the direct head to heart to fingers to voice connection that we've really enjoyed it. Plus, you work with tremendous musicians, as you have through your whole career, but to have, I think the first time I encountered your solo set, Sam Bush was in the band, and you've worked with some people we admire so much, and you've come to that scene, and that scene's come to you in one of those matches that I'm like, that's what I love about this community. That's it working.
Yes.
And
there's a musical open-mindedness here, and also it gave me the opportunity to go back to my real roots before Hall & Oates to really. It gave me that was the key to going forward, was to tap into the things I did as a kid and realize that could be the beginning of a kind of a solo voice for me. So I'm very, very grateful for that.
great. Folks, who's got a question? Let's start out here.
Stand up, talk loud.
Yeah.
Hi, John. I guess my question is, was there a span of time that you did not pick up your guitar or play music?
The early 90s.
Early 90s.
I mean, I never stopped completely, but I hardly did anything musically in the early 90s. Daryl and I weren't touring very much. We did the occasional odd show just to keep the home fires burning, so to speak. But no, we didn't record. I did a few productions. I went and produced some, I went to Australia and wrote Electric Blue with Icehouse. I did a band in Canada called Parachute Club, and I had a crazy experience, which I think is a separate book, in Tulsa, Oklahoma with a guy named Jerry Lynn Williams, and had a great experience with that. But no, I guess the early 90s was about the only time. Then the mid-90s, I started coming to Nashville, and that kind of kick-started things for me. What's that? Oh, thanks, yeah. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. No, I'm not telling a story of that. Sure, I'll tell a story of that. Do you want to hear a story? Okay. Do we have time? All right. I met Iva Davies, who's the principal writer of Icehouse in New York, and I wasn't doing much. And he said, "Well, we should get together." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Do you want to come to Sydney, Australia?" I said, "Yes." And so I went to Sydney, and he flew me down, he put me up, and we started working together, and nothing was happening. And I was I felt bad because he had brought me all the way to Australia, and it wasn't happening. And I don't know if you know anything about Australia, especially in those days, but all the beaches are topless. So one day we just said, this is not happening, let's just go to the beach. So we went to the beach, and I'm sitting on the beach, and this gal was walking past, and she had really deep blue eyes. As I stared deeply into her eyes, that song just popped into my head. Thanks, Kate. Real nice.
Inspiration, folks. Inspiration. There's a hand, sir.
As you prepare for your upcoming tour, is there a lot of physical conditioning that goes into that?
As I've gotten older, yeah, I mean, you do. Not only physically in terms of your body, but the throat especially, and your voice. The voice is a muscle, I've noticed it as I've gotten older. I have to protect it. And Daryl's in the same boat as me, if not even more, because he sings very, very hard. So yeah, it's an issue that you do have to address. And that's the thing about, I've always made a lot of decisions over the years in terms of, abusing, myself or whatever. But I've always come back to the final analysis. Do I want to do this for the rest of my life? And the answer has always been yes. So I've made decisions based on that. Yeah.
Any regrets?
Over any particular part of my life? Yeah, I regret not paying more attention to the business side of things. But then again, I'm actually glad I didn't, because if I wouldn't have had this kind of downfall, there wouldn't have been my opportunity to meet my wife and do all the things I did. I mean, maybe I would have kept going and lived in New York and just kind of wallowed in my pop stardom.
Question way over here. You might want to stand and be loud.
Is there anything that you haven't done yet that you'd like to?
Yeah, I wanted to fly with the Blue Angels, but now I think I'm too old.
Yes, sir.
Hey, John. She's Gone is my favorite Hall and Oates song. Because you get to hear both of you musically and vocally. And I thought Tavares did a good job when they recorded that. What's your favorite?
That. No, it is, because it's the song that put us on the map. It's the song that the world heard about us for the first time. It was a true collaboration. We wrote it, and it was an inspired moment. It really, I came up with the chorus when I got stood up on a date on New Year's Eve, which was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And Daryl had gone through a divorce, and we just sat in the apartment, and we looked around the apartment and picked everyday things that symbolize loss. And somehow we were able to kind of take a universal feeling of loss and make it feel very real and everyday and personal. And I think that's why that song has resonated over the years.
Sir.
What would you say is your proudest moment in your musical career?
The fact that I'm sitting here and doing this, honestly. The fact that I'm still allowed to do it, that people actually care enough to come to see Daryl and I, that people allow me to make the records I want to make. And I think I'm most proud of the fact that I've achieved this sense of creative freedom, which I think every creative person would love to have. And the success that I've had with Daryl has enabled me to have that. And very few people in life get to that point where they can do anything they want to do. And I've actually achieved that. And so because of that, I'm very aware of it and I'm very conscious of it. And I don't want to abuse it. I want to wring every second out of it. And I want to make sure that I'm very grateful for it. And I never forget that.
You're playing with Daryl in town here in the coming weeks.
May 24th at Bridgestone with Tears for Fears. Yes.
Yeah. And
I think we got a question right there.
Thanks for being here. My favorite song is Open All Night, and I don't think it's got enough. All right. I want to know exactly, because I remember my older brother being in college and bringing back the 8-track of your CD. How did it feel to you when you found out you made a connection with everybody and that you were, I don't know if you felt that you were on your way, but at least that you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think the connection is made every night, and it's made new every night. Well, the first time it happened was in Philadelphia, when Daryl and I did a telethon. We were playing in coffee houses and art galleries to about 10 people, 5 people, no people. And there was a telethon for a charity event, and they needed to fill up a 24-hour period of time. So they basically would take anyone. And we went to this television studio, and we set up, and we played. And the day after that happened, everything changed. And now it changed just in the world, little insular world of Philadelphia, but nevertheless, I sensed it. All of a sudden, people were, we saw you on TV, you guys were great. It was like, okay, all right, something's going on here.
time for a couple more.
Hi. Hey, John. Question for you. And I grew up in Nashville, so it's even kind of weird to see how much this city has grown. And I actually went down to Austin for a while, and that was kind of, I do photo, like getting me back into my artist group. And the whole city was just magic to me. You talk about how Nashville just kind of got you back into songwriting again, and you rediscovered that magic. Was there a particular venue in town, or whether it was like Leaper's Fork, like Puckett's, or the Rhymer?
There's been a whole bunch of them. It started with the first demo session that I ever did in the mid-'90s here. I didn't know anything about how it worked here. And Nashville, if you know anything about making records and demos, there's a whole system to it. And I had written some songs, and a good friend of mine, Keith Follesay, who invited me here to write with him, said, you should go in and make some demos. And I said, oh, okay, who am I going to use? He said, I'll find you some guys. And I had no idea who they were going to be. And I walked into the studio, and there were 4 or 5 guys, and I didn't know any of them. And I sat down, I played them the songs, and they wrote their little charts with the numbers, and which was completely hieroglyphics to me. I had no idea about that. And I sat down, and we began to play. And the first time we played these songs, they sounded amazing. And I went, oh, there's something going on here that I'm not aware of. And I felt like I was home in a weird way, musically home. And I thought, I can do this. This is cool. And it took me a long time. And then years later, when I first made my first solo album here in, I think, 2007, I just had these incredible people surrounding me, and everything I did just seemed to float on a cloud of skill and passion, and it was just so great that I drank the Kool-Aid, and that was all I needed to know.
Is there one more?
Is Circle of Three about the family?
Yes, Circle of Three, I wrote about my wife and my son. We only have one son, and I've always felt like there's a magic to the number three and the concept of a trinity, and I wrote that song about them. Yeah.
And can I ask one more thing? I heard you on Sirius on Friday, just happened to come across it, and you talked about Philadelphia sound. And I want to know, do you feel about the Philadelphia sound like you would for Motown?
Well, the Philadelphia, back in the 60s, you have to remember, music was separated regionally in America. Now, if you went to Memphis, you heard certain songs on the radio. You went to Philadelphia, you heard certain songs on the radio. They weren't the same songs. It wasn't this, top 40 hit national chart where everyone was playing the same music. It was distinctly different. You went to Chicago, you heard there was Chicago blues, Motown in Detroit. Philadelphia had its own sound. New York had its own sound. California had its own sound, of course. I love that. I love the regionalism of the early days of American popular music. And Philadelphia's sound is a very unique sound. It borrows from a lot of things, which we probably don't have time for. But I think one thing that people don't think about when they think about Philadelphia is they, of course, think about Gamble and Huff, and quite rightly so, because they made amazing R&B records. But Philadelphia was the first city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So after the Civil War, a lot of African Americans migrated immediately to the first place they could find, which was Philadelphia. So you have this very deep Southern roots culture in Philadelphia, which a lot of people don't think about. But then you have this very kind of white Anglo-Saxon church, classical, educated kind of history in Pennsylvania from the English and English history. And it's those two things blended together that form a very unique style. Philadelphia music's characterized by a lot of strings and violins, which kind of the classical, a little bit more sophisticated style, and a very deep, soulful street thing. And, so it's really unique that way. And I think Philadelphia music is, there's nothing like it in the world.
I liked in the book, too, that you made several references to Philadelphia's stature as the birthplace of the country and its government. You walk past Independence Hall, and you just made a note of that, and it was nice, because it did seem to bring a kind of your sense of freedom and your sense that what you were looking for, seeking that destiny, was kind of woven up in
I'm
that.
a history buff, and I've always appreciated when you walk down the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, you were literally walking in the footsteps of Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and all that, and it's real. It's a cool thing about it.
It is indeed. Well, is it time for some music, Kate?
Sure.
Let's have some songs from John Oates. John Oates, thank you for the conversation.
So I'm going to play some old stuff for you. I started looking into the early days of, being a person who has been a recording artist his whole life, basically. I started to think about, I don't really know much about the history of American popular music. I mean, I know like rock and roll, but I'm talking about what was the first hit? What was the first hit record? You guys know? Well, you're about to find out. I started doing some research, and I said, you know what? Anybody who works in a profession and doesn't know where the profession came from, that's kind of weird. So I started researching, and I found this guy, Emmett Miller, who had recorded in the 1920s. And it was a time when the phonograph machine was becoming available to people to have in their house. They could buy a record and listen to it. Prior to that, if you wanted to hear music, you had to go hear someone playing live. And so it was a kind of a weird concept. And this guy had this hit record, and it was so popular that I think it sold 1 million copies. And he had to play it. When he played it live, people made him play it 3 or 4 times in a row. I'm only going to do it once, so don't worry. Okay. Anytime you're feeling lonely, anytime you're feeling blue, anytime you feel downhearted, that will prove my love for you is true. Anytime you're thinking about me, that's the time I'll be thinking of you. So anytime you say, want me back again, that's the time I'll come back home to you. So anytime you say, you want me back again, that's the time I'll come back home to you. Just a little thing. So I've been working on a project, and I'm, as I said, going back to the stuff that made me want to be a musician when I was a kid, the early, the Delta blues and stuff like that. And I always wanted to make a record that really kind of paid tribute to that. And I think Craig mentioned Mississippi John Hurt was one of my big heroes, and I said, well, you know what? Let me do a kind of a tribute to Mississippi John Hurt. And as I started to do it, I realized that why should I do something that's already been done? But at the same time, I love the music so much, and I started to gather a group of musicians around and said, let's kind of take these really traditional, cool songs and kind of see if we can, kind of add a little bit of modern sensibility to them and see where it takes us. So I'm really excited about this project. It's called Hurt, and this song is a real classic Delta blues that a lot of people have recorded, and I put a little modern twist to it, and I'm calling it Palette Soft and Low. Make me down a pallet on your floor. Oh, won't you let me down a pallet on your floor? Make me down a pallet, down so soft and low. Oh, won't you bake me down a pallet on your floor? On up the country where it's cold and freezing snow, Colorado Bay. I said, gone up the country where it's cold and freezing snow. I'm going to Colorado where it's cold and freezing snow. And ain't no telling how much further I may go. And soft and low, Make me a pallet on your floor. Don't you let my good girl find me here. I said, don't you let my good girl find you here. Oh, baby, she might cut you, beat and starve you too. Ain't no telling what that little girl can do. Ain't no telling what that little girl can do. Soft and low, make me a pallet on your floor. I wanna make it soft, I'm gonna make it low. Make me a pallet on your floor. Thank you. And let's see, one more. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think I got one more in me. You know what? I'll do a co-write that I did with the great Jim Lauderdale, because he's one of my good buddies, and he's a fantastic guy and a great artist, and I just love hanging around with him. He's been a lot of fun to be a best friend with here in Nashville. And I spent a lot of time traveling, obviously, and one day I was in the Denver airport and happened to overhear these two women having this very heated conversation, and one woman was saying to the other, "You let him come to you." So I said, sounds like a good title to me. And Jim and I were writing a song. We usually do our best work after midnight for many reasons. And it was about 2 a.m. and we had finished the song, and Jim was getting ready to leave. And I said, "Hey, Jim, I heard these two women talking." He said, "Let him come to you." And he turned around and he went, "Let's write that right now." It was like 3 o'clock in the morning we started writing this. So. Oh, and the cool thing was, as we began to write it, we thought, wouldn't it be cooler if it was a guy talking to a girl as opposed to one woman talking to another? Let him come to you. Don't chase him away. Be the one to choose. Make him pay his dues. Let him come to you. I'll say it like a friend. The story never ends. Here we go again. Nothing I can do. Let him come to you. 'Cause you got it right. You've got it right in front of your eyes, and I will still be waiting until you let me come to you. Yeah, you got it right. You've got it right in front of your eyes, and I will still be waiting until you let me come to you. If he comes to you, then I'll walk away. If that's what you want, to your heart be true. Let him come to you. So I'll say again, nothing I can do. Let him come. Let him come to you. Nothing I can do. Ooh. 'Cause if that's what you want, to your heart be true. Just let him come to you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'll be signing some books for you if you want, and thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the book.